Nigeria. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here, and I am so excited to have a conversation both today and tomorrow with you about some amazing topics. And tomorrow I'll be talking about my Carla's pearls, my my hard-earned and hard-learned pearls after being a woman and a woman of color on Wall Street as of this summer for 31 years. As I like to say, I've learned a few things about not only surviving, but more importantly, thriving in the seat that you sit in or the seat that you aspire to sit in. And that's what the pearls are all about. But I'm particularly excited today that I have an opportunity, thanks to your leadership, to have a conversation about diversity and inclusion and why it matters. And then I'm really important to share the stage with Faye to have a conversation that she will tailor, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So let me get started with my comments so that I can move on to this conversation. Now, it's interesting to me that we are 30 years into this conversation at the corporate level around diversity and inclusion. 30 years, because I remember back in 91, 92, when people were first starting to talk about diversity, that everyone talked about it in the context of the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And one of the reasons that I will assert to you that we are not farther along globally around this diversity and now diversity and inclusion conversation is because it has been housed in the context of the right thing to do as opposed to the commercial thing to do. If people had thought about it as a commercial imperative, then I would submit to you that we would be a lot further along in 30 years. Because you see, those things that are of strategic importance, you don't work at, you get done. But we're still working at diversity and inclusion because it hasn't been housed in a strategic and a commercial imperative. I find it interesting that 2018, I still hear people housing it in the context of the right thing to do. So what I have done is come up with my own definition of the business imperative for diversity and inclusion. So if any of you find yourselves in a conversation where people are talking about why we need diversity, why we need gender diversity, or why we even need diversity with respect to ethnicities and races, here is the business case. There is not one industry where we are not competing around innovation. Every industry that I can think of, whether it is healthcare, whether it is infrastructure, whether it is transportation, whether it is financial services, commercial packaging, CPG, you name it, innovation is the dominant competitive parameter. Well, if we are all competing around innovation, that means you need a lot of different ideas in the room in order to get to that one idea that will allow you to obtain and retain a leadership position. Because innovation, at the end of the day, is born from ideas. So to get to that one idea that will allow your company and or your industry to obtain and retain a leadership position, you need a lot of ideas in the room. Well, if you need a lot of ideas in the room, you need a lot of perspectives in the room, because ideas are born from perspectives. And if you need a lot of perspectives in the room, you need a lot of experiences in the room, because perspectives are born from experiences. And if you need a lot of experiences in the room, you better start with a lot of different people in the room, because experiences are born from people. So you need to start with a lot of different people in the room in order to get to that one innovative idea that will allow you to lead. That is the business case for diversity. You cannot innovate if you don't start with a lot of different people in the room. So if innovation is what you are competing around, you must have a lot of different people in the room. And if you can get people to focus on the commercial imperative around having different voices at the table, then you can get people to embrace, implement, more importantly, consistently execute around diversity and inclusion. Every time they are thinking about putting a team together, they will think about how can we have diverse voices and experiences around the table. The second thing that I think is really driving this away from the business case, if you can embrace the business case, is the fact that we are living in a world now that is very multicultural and it's very diverse. In the United States alone, women are making up a majority of those who are graduating from master's and college programs. Well, how can you put yourself in a position to compete if you are not availing yourselves of the best minds around the table? And if you consistently keep a group of people from the table, then you are not giving yourself the chance to win, because you are not giving yourself the opportunity to get the best minds, to get access to those who might implement and execute in a way that has never been done. It's interesting to me that even today, people would rather disadvantage themselves by keeping someone from the table than focusing at the end of the day on winning. And I would submit to you that because every company today is facing a new constituency, they will have to make sure that they are thinking about those other voices. And what is the constituency? It used to be that there were 3 constituencies that every company had to worry about. 1, the shareholder base. 2, their customers. And 3, their employees. But today, there's a 4th one called community. And that 4th one is being powered by social media. So if you make a misstep, now that is exposed in a way that has never been exposed before. And I don't want to name the companies, but we all know great companies that have great brand franchises that have been impaired in the last 12 months because there was a misstep around women or a misstep around people of color. And as soon as the misstep was taken, it was all over Twitter. It was all over Facebook. It was all over Instagram. And the company has spent billions of dollars in a very short period of time trying to fix the brand infraction. And today, if you want to compete in the global environment, you cannot afford to leave voices around the table unheard, because you expose yourself to that gap in the marketplace. Now, what does it take in order to have a successful diversity and inclusion, a successful and sustainable effort? It takes 3 things. It takes intentionality, it takes accountability, and it takes consistency. People ask me all the time, why aren't we further along in gender diversity, especially on Wall Street, since we've been doing this for a long time? And I would submit that it has been primarily a bull market phenomenon. Whenever the market's going well, lots of money, lots of focus, we're hiring lots of women. But as soon as there's a bear market environment, the intensity goes from 10 to 1. It doesn't go away, but there's no longer the spotlight, there's no longer the intensity, and it continues to put us in a position where we bring a lot in, we lose them when we get in a bear market environment, either because there's a restructuring or reduction in force, or people just leave because they're deciding that they want to do something different. And now, 4 years later, we find ourselves in a bull market environment. You're building all again. And you all have been talking about the perception issue that you have as a country. It's the same thing in my industry, same thing in financial services, same thing in Wall Street. It's seen as a very difficult place for women to work. You won't have a life. You have to make a decision between being a mom and a partner and then having a career. And I've been in this business 31 years, and I would submit, have been able to, quote, have it all. Having it all is really a function of how you define it, not how the greater society defines it. But because there's a perception that it's so difficult, women don't come into the space as often as they should. So you have to make sure that you're creating a different kind of perception, and you have to make sure that you are intentional when there are bear market environments that you hold on to the women that you have been able to recruit, and you hold on to the people of color that you have been able to recruit. You must be intentional about it. You also have to have accountability. It's nice that the CEO says that it's important, but at the end of the day, diversity and inclusion does not stop at the CEO level. Where there is a lack of execution is in the middle. I call it the immovable middle. The CEO can say it's important all day long, but if those managers in the middle are not treating women well, they're not treating people of color well, those folks will leave. Your stars will leave. And the one thing that I love about the millennial generation that was different than us as boomers, we would kind of hang in there and stick it out no matter what. But the millennials, they'll just leave. They'll just leave. So you lose your best talent. You lose your future. When we are working in a financial services industry, guess what? Our assets go up and down on the elevator every day. So if you don't have the best people, you will not have the most competitive company. You will not be the employer of choice. And what happens when people leave at the middle and below, there's a narrative that is created once it gets to the CEO about why they're losing their best women. So they never really hear the truth. So you have to have a measure of accountability in the middle if you want to make sure that you're going to be successful. And oh, by the way, if you're going to bring women from the outside, one of the things that I say to CEOs all the time is if you have to laterally recruit, and many companies will have to laterally recruit because they did not consistently build in having women and people of color at the top. Now in 2018, when it is an imperative, they look up and they don't have them. And every company would like to feel that they could grow them. We like to bring them in at the entry level and then grow them to more senior positions. The problem with that is that it takes 10 years to create a senior officer. 10 years. And we don't have that kind of time because the rate of innovation today is 18 months. And so you're lucky if you're able to keep them around for 5 years because most companies haven't realized that they have to create a value proposition for millennials and Xers to stay. Again, those of us who were boomers, we looked at success as being with one company for 20, 25, or 30 years. That doesn't exist today. So companies now have to create a value proposition for their people to stay, but most haven't figured that out. So you don't have 10 years to bring someone in at the entry level and grow them to be a senior officer. If you need them now, because millennials need to see it now in order to say that they want to work at that company, that means you have to bring them in from the outside. And what I've been saying to a lot of CEOs recently is if you need to bring them in from the outside, you must guard against organ rejection. And they say, organ rejection, Carla? I said, yes. It goes like this. Anybody that has received a kidney or a liver through an organ transplant will tell you that post the surgery, the surgeons give them 20 different drugs solely for the purpose of having the body hold on to the kidney because the body will naturally dispel that which is foreign. So despite the fact that the body needs the kidney, it will push it out. So despite the fact that your organization needs women, when you bring women in laterally, if you do not overinvest in their success, they will not be as successful as they can be. They will never reach their potential. And as I said, a narrative is created when people leave. And most companies will make you interview 15 to 18 different times before they give you the offer. And so how can you tell me when that person leaves that you made a recruiting mistake? Really? 15, 18 interviews? You made a mistake? I would submit to you the problem is not the candidate, it's the house. So you have to have a level of accountability. And the last thing, as I said, is the consistency. You must have the intensity through bull and bear market environments if you want to build a team of great women and great men in your organization. And again, It is imperative that you do it, or you will not be the employer of choice. You will not have the best minds. You will not be able to innovate. And if you cannot innovate in this environment, you cannot compete at the end of the day. And as I close, as we go to this conversation, let me give you one last thought. If you are sitting in the leadership seat, ladies and gentlemen, you have to be intentional. You have chosen a profession called the financial services profession that has really been a producer culture for a long time. If you brought in revenues, you were rewarded, you were compensated. If you brought in revenues and new clients, you were promoted. If you brought in lots of revenues and lots of new clients, you were given a leadership seat. And it mattered not really whether or not you could lead or you could manage. You were just a great producer, and that's how you were rewarded. The problem is now we're living in an environment where people want to be led, they want to be inspired, they want to be motivated, and frankly, they want to be managed. So if you have chosen to take on the leadership seat, you have to be intentional. Being a leader is contact sports. You have to be intentional, and you must be intentional around 8 things. You must be intentional around your authenticity. If you do not bring your authentic self to the table, then you will not inspire and motivate those who are working with you to bring their authentic selves to the table. And when any of us is in an environment where we can be who we really are, we always outperform. And that will accrue to your status in the leadership seat. You must also be intentional about building trust. If people trust you, they will go the extra mile for you. And you want those who are working with you to give you the extra. You never want the job description. You always want the extra. That will also accrue to your status in that leadership seat. You must be intentional about creating other leaders. Those of you, and I'm really talking to my sisters here in the audience because we have a real problem with this. I don't often give gender-specific advice, but here's where I'll do it. We tend to hold on to all the things that we've been doing from the time we came into an organization to 10 years later. If you are getting overwhelmed, you have too much on your plate. If you are in the leadership seat, you should let go a substantial amount of the things that you have been doing and give them to someone else so that you can develop them into being a leader. Leadership, and I say this to the gentlemen and the ladies in the room, leadership is a journey from execution to empowerment. From execution to empowerment. When you're trying to get to the leadership seat, oh yes, you better execute. But when you get to the leadership seat, it's all about empowering and creating other leaders at the end of the day. And if you're having a hard time letting go of things, here is some imagery that I'll give to you. We just finished baseball season in the United States. And I will tell you, I am reminded when I don't want to let go of something that I cannot get to second base with my foot still on first. I have to be willing to let it go if I want to really soar and be the kind of leader that I can be. You must be intentional about creating clarity. You must be intentional about diversity, which I just talked about. You must be intentional around inclusivity, which means soliciting other people's voices. If you are a man in the room and you have a diverse team and you want to make sure that they feel comfortable giving you their best ideas, you need to solicit their voices. IB, how you thinking about that? Faye, I'd like you to push back on her idea. We want to figure out where the gaps are in our argument. Thomas, I want you to think about how would you push back on Faye's idea. We want to make sure we've covered all the gaps before we take this product to market. You do that 4 times as a leader with your group, you won't have to solicit anybody's voice a 5th time. They will know you now value their contributions, that you see them, you value them. You must also be very intentional about making sure you teach your team how to fail, which means you must be intentional around innovation. Women in particular, we don't like to fail. But if you don't like to fail, that means you are not taking as many risks as you should be taking. So you need to empower your team so that they understand that failure is a necessary part of innovating, that there'll be no retribution for making a mistake. And then lastly, you have to be intentional about your voice. If you're going to be an intentional leader, you have to have the courage to call a thing a thing. And if it's a thing, you got to call it as a thing. And most often, especially when there are inequities in the environment, we are afraid to speak. And we are afraid of what people may say about us speaking. We are afraid that we won't be invited to the meeting anymore. We are afraid that they'll take away the power. Well, newsflash, if you have been invited into the room, you have a place at the table. And if you have a place at the table, you have a responsibility to speak. Nobody's going to take away the power. You have earned the right to be in the room and earned the right to be at the table. It is a figment of your imagination. So do not create the narrative between your left ear and your right ear that you're all of a sudden going to lose this power. You have painstakingly earned it. So understand the power that you have in your hand and use it. Your voice is at the heart of your power. When you submerge your voice, you become irrelevant. And when you become irrelevant, you put a target on the front and a target on the back. It's important that if you are choosing the leadership seat, that you exercise your voice. And ladies and gentlemen, as I close and go to this exciting conversation, I tell you that if you want to maximize your success, you must both expect and strategize to win. I thank you, and now we'll go to this conversation.
Thank you, Carla.
Thank you, Faye.
That was amazing.
Thank you.
I feel like I need to just let it percolate for a bit, make sure it's sunk in. Did you hear what she said? Thank you very much. I think that you make such a compelling business case for why inclusion is important, why we need more women. You talked about innovation. There is actually a commercial imperative, as you said. And I wonder because, there are a lot of leading men here, and they see the statistics, they see the incremental improvement in profits when you include more women in leadership. Why hasn't it sort of sunk into their hearts? Why doesn't it matter as much to them?
Yes. I think actually, the more I talk to senior leaders, the more I realize it's not because they don't want to, it's because they don't know how to. And it's interesting, when I go to speak at a company, more and more what's happening is I may be invited to do something like this where I speak to their top 400 women or their top 500 producers. And generally they'll say to me, well, since you're on our campus, will you spend some time with our CEO? Will you spend some time with the executive committee? And as soon as I get behind closed doors, the question that I get, in addition to how do we keep our best women, how do we attract more women, they'll say, well, Carla, what does it mean to be an inclusive leader? What does that look like? How does it manifest itself? So my conclusion for you is that the reason why it's not getting done is because no one has really gone out there and defined, and I'm trying to do it now, but nobody has defined how do you show up as an inclusive leader? What does it mean to be an inclusive leader? So they see the data that says having more women makes a big difference at the end of the day, but they're still struggling with how do I get them and how do I keep them? And the key to that is, frankly, being an inclusive leader. And the second reason I think it hasn't caught on as much is that in most industries, there are leaders and that there are followers. And again, people are waiting to see what is the best case or what's best practice in that industry before they wholesale follow. And I find it fascinating that even in an industry like ours of financial services, if you say, oh, we should be doing X, and X is sort of leading edge, the first question leadership will say is, what is so-and-so doing? Exactly. What is so-and-so doing? I.e., what's the competition doing? Yeah. And what I find interesting about that is, why do you care what the competition is doing? Do you want to lead, or do you want to just sort of be one of? And one of my favorite sayings is that leaders don't compete, leaders disrupt.
Very good. That's very good. Thank you. Thanks for that. I'm going to help the men here because this sneak peek into how you can become an inclusive leader. Just to unpack that a little bit more, what is the one thing you would like them to go away with? Because we get it, we know why it's important, but I think the men are still struggling a little bit, So how do we help them, So what should they do when they leave here, when they go back to work? What's the one thing you think they should do to become more inclusive, to expand the leadership?
Yes. The number one thing is what I just talked about. Solicit people's voices on your teams. So don't wait for the people on your team to put forth an idea. Call them out. We call it cold calling at Harvard Business School. Cold call them. They walk in a meeting and you should put it out. Here's what I'm thinking. Here's the straw man, but I know I'm not the smartest person in the room. I want you guys to push back on my idea. So let's start here. Who can add or who can tell me where the holes are in this idea? And actually call them out. Faye, what are you thinking? Anna, what are you thinking? Tom, what are you thinking? And do that repeatedly. That's the first thing they should do so that they can really hear. Because what happens when you do that as a leader is that you're saying, I see you and I hear you, especially when you respond to what they're saying. And everybody values being heard. Everybody values being heard. And people value being seen.
Absolutely.
So as a leader, when you're saying, I see you, now your team is saying, oh, he sees me.
Yes.
Oh, he values me. They associate that with value. And if I know that you value me, then I want to give even more, right? So you're going to spur more productivity. The second thing I would tell them to do, and actually they can do this as homework this weekend, think about their team and really think about what you think of those that are on your team. And when you start saying, oh, but she doesn't have a lot of presence, or oh, she's quiet, ask yourself why you think that. And have you seen evidence of that, or are you creating that narrative in your own mind? That's called unconscious bias. And one of the best practices that I think exists today is to take all of your best people through unconscious bias training, because we all have it. And I think that it disproportionately hurts women, especially if the male leader has this unconscious bias. Because again, they'll say things like, oh, she doesn't have presence. I was once told, or it was said about me, that I didn't have presence.
What? I find that hard to believe.
Me too. Me. I don't have presence, right? But that was one of those throwaway stereotypes that were created about women, and certainly women of color, Asian women, black women, Hispanic women. So the question is, somebody like me who has such a big mouth, how is it that I don't have presence? Yeah. And I say and when the person said that to me, I'm like, excuse me, but I'm a big black woman. You cannot miss me when I walk in the room. What's the issue? But it's the perception. Yeah. So I challenge the men, what is your thinking around the women that are on your team, and why do you think that?
That's very good. Carla is very tough. She's going to check in on your homework, so please do your homework. Let's talk a little bit about your career, because it's such a fascinating 31 years on Wall Street at a time when it wasn't popular to be thinking about women or diversity. So what have you done differently? How have you been so successful?
Yeah, I'll tell you. First of all, prayer. Yes, first thing. No question that has been a major part of my life from the beginning to the end. And the other thing I would tell you is that I am very self-reflective and very self-aware. Yeah. So every time I had a situation that did not go well, I would study it. You know, my husband says, who's in the audience, he says to me all the time, you think too much. But I would think, okay, what happened? How did I get here? What did I do to contribute, as opposed to what was the organization doing to me? I always like to think in terms of your own empowerment, right? Because if you start saying they're doing this, they're doing that, then you have put yourself on the outside of your own success circle, and there's one person that drives that. So every time something didn't go well, I would actually dissect it and figure out why, extract the lesson, and be prepared to apply the lesson the next time. And I think that is actually what helped me acquire the pearls that I wrote about in my first book, Expect to Win. And then I think the third thing is that I realized also early on that I needed relationships, because I grew up in an environment where, I was told you could do it, just keep your head down, work really hard. And frankly, that's what you're sold in college, and that's what you're sold in business school when companies come to recruit you. We're a meritocracy. You're smart, you work hard, you'll go right to the top. But that doesn't work. You are going to need somebody else's relationships. And that was against my culture, where I had grown up knowing you could do it on your own. Put your head down, you can get it done. And you can't. So you have to figure out a way to build relationships, and sometimes exercise your power to ask somebody for their sponsorship, ask somebody for help. And I think that, along with hard work, obviously made the difference, especially understanding the power of those relationships. And then, like I said, my spirituality was a key part, because when things didn't go well, I would really go deep into prayer and I think about it, as opposed to saying, okay, that's a sign I shouldn't be here. I would stop and remember who's still on the throne.
It's very good.
Yeah.
Relationships and sponsors. There are a lot of young women in the room who are figuring out their careers, looking at yours and thinking, how do I build something like this? People like myself, trying to aspire to be more. How can we be more intentional about building these relationships and reaching out to these sponsors?
Yes. Thank you for that question. And I would say that you have to be intentional. That's a very good word, because it was not natural for me either to build these relationships. I am an executor by nature. If you tell me to get it done, if it's on the list, I'm going to execute. So going to chit chat and have some small talk, I didn't have time for that. But again, when I realized how important it was, because it was not natural, I leveraged my strengths. And if my strength is an executor and it gets done, if I put it on the list, I put it on the list. I literally would write coffee with John, go by Sam's office, ask Lisa how her weekend was. I would literally put it on the list in order to get it done, because left to my own devices, I would not have done it. So that's how you can be intentional about it. Map out, who do I want to build relationships with? First of all, ask yourself the question, do I have a sponsor? And for those of you who don't know what a sponsor is, unlike a mentor, a sponsor is the person that's carrying your paper into the room. That's the room where all the decisions are made about your career, your promotions, your next assignments, whether or not you're going to get paid a great bonus. All of that happens behind closed doors. If you're not in the room, somebody has to be speaking on your behalf. And that person speaking on your behalf is spending their currency on your behalf. That is a sponsor. A mentor is the person you can tell the good, the bad, and the ugly to, the person that can give you advice that is tailored to you and tailored to your career. But that sponsor is the person who's going to say, yeah, Faye deserves this shot. She's done A, B, C, and D. I think she'll do a great job for us. And they're putting their word on the line. And so you got to be intentional first about building that relationship. Who's carrying my paper into the room? If you can't answer that question today, who's carrying your paper into the room, then I will tell you to spend some time figuring out who that might be. Who might be your sponsor? You're working too hard if you haven't figured that out yet. And then you look for the person that has this profile. Somebody who has exposure to your work, because they have to have credibility behind closed doors. So if they don't have exposure, how can they talk on your behalf? Everybody else in that room will know that they're full of it, right? So first of all, they have to have exposure to your work. They have to have a seat at the decision-making table, and they have to have some juice. So you find somebody in your environment that has that profile, and then you design a strategy where you're going to interact with that person, because it is frequency of touch that helps you build relationships. And then you go from there to build other relationships in your environment.
Very good, thank you. I have a lot of questions for Carla. I personally have a lot of questions for Carla, but you can also ask your questions. So please use the app, submit your questions. I'm happy to keep asking my questions. I'll go away with very happy. My cup will be full, but you might want to ask your own questions too. You once said that someone has said to you that you were not tough enough. Yeah. And I found that really interesting. A lot of women, struggle with, I think, the opposite actually, and trying to not be too hard, too tough, come across as too aggressive. you know. And do you have any advice for the women in the audience? How do they deal with that whole?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's funny, it's a stereotype that certainly exists around women of color. And black women in particular, being the angry black woman. Yeah. And, you know, it's funny, I realized why that happens so easily is because often when we want to be taken seriously in an environment, we tend to look like this as we're walking around. Yeah, I don't want you to be confused. I'm here just to get my job done, right? And as a result, people create a narrative about us. Angry black woman, hard to work with, difficult, not a team player, right? And we forget how much power there is in this, right? We forget, right? And I will tell you that even if you're in an environment where you have to give critical feedback or bad news, this is still a very powerful thing because it is inviting. At the end of the day, it says, come on in, I'm ready to receive you. And that is the number one thing that we can do is to create a different narrative as opposed to us being tough or difficult to work with, is you got to think about the power that's on your face. Think about the power that's on your face. And many times you are the only woman in that environment. Well, if you're the only woman or one of two or three in an environment that's male-dominated, please understand, ladies, that there is a big spotlight on you. And even though you think no one is paying attention, everybody sees you. Yeah. And so often people say to me, but what do I do when I'm the only woman in the room? I said, if you're the only woman in the room, guess what? You're the only woman in the room, right? You don't have to compete for attention. When everybody else is fighting to be heard, the minute you open your mouth, you know, everybody's focusing on you. And all you have to do is to deliver your excellence right into that expectation. Yeah. And you have excellence. You wouldn't be there, right? So watch this, right? And watch your language also and your tone. All of that creates a narrative. People are over-focusing on you. So if you are coming off as being very difficult, then you're going to have a hard time in that environment. You cannot lead if other people won't follow.
Very true, very true. My husband is in the audience, so I need to talk about something that's really important. I need to talk about money.
Okay.
And the pay inequality.
Yes.
That, first of all, I need you to help me explain to everyone that it is real. Yeah. That it is true that women in the same roles get anything between 20 and 50% less than their male counterparts for doing the exact same job. It is real. Then, if you can just tell us, what can we do about this? And, you know, how do we change that?
Yes. So one of the reasons that I think this pay inequality has existed for so long is I think we as women did not have the tools to negotiate appropriately. Yeah. We have often been takers of the number as opposed to givers of the number. So the first thing is that you need to understand the market price for your seat. And every seat has a market price. Yeah. And today, it's unlike 30 or 40 years ago, it's much easier to understand the market value of your seat because it's public. You know, whether you go to Mercer.com, Salary.com, the Glassdoor, there are all these different resources that are available now that will say if you are out of school, out of MBA for 10 years and you're doing X, then the range, the pay range for what you're doing is between X and Y. So that's the first thing you should know. Second thing is when you go in to get the job, you ought to be steadfast that you will only accept a job if it's at the market value. And don't let anybody undersell you based on what you were making in the last job. Because again, traditionally, people have tried to peg your pay against what you were coming from. So if you poorly negotiated on job number one, then you're going to be under on job number two, and you're going to be under in job number three. So here's your script. Let's say you poorly negotiated, and let's say the job that you're interviewing now is for 180, the market value of the seat is between 180 and $200,000. And you are coming from a job where you were making 125. So now you get the offer. The person says to you, will we be delighted to have you on board, and we'd like to make you an offer for $150,000. Now, that's still below the market value of the seat, even though it's above what you were making before. Yeah. So your answer, your script should be, I'm delighted that you're giving me this offer. I would be very happy to join the team, and I agree with you that I could be value add for this team, and in fact, I would hit the ground running. And if your offer was consistent with the market value of the seat, which my research tells me is between 180 and 200, I'd hit that bid. I'd hit that bid. And then the person says, wait, the person says, but you were making 125, and I'm giving you an offer for 150,000. You know, that's a 20% increase on what you're doing. I understand that, but what I was making before is irrelevant to this role, because this role has a value of 180 to 200, and I'm sure you are expecting that I would give you the full value of that seat. And if I'm going to contribute that, I'd like to get that, right? And I will tell you that the person is not going to extract the offer. They've already played their hand. They've already told you that they're giving you that they like to give you the offer, so they want you, number one. Number two, here's another news flash. When someone is looking for someone in a specific role and they have made their budget, nobody puts a lower number in the budget, because nobody wants to go back to the boss and say, oh, I found a great candidate, but the number that they want is above what we put in the budget. So when they're making the budget, they always put the highest value of the seat in the budget. So if they can get you for less than that, of course they're going to do that. Absolutely. That's pretty good. But you need to hold your ground and say market value is between X and Y. And if they really want you as a candidate, they're going to take you. So we cannot put ourselves in a position where that 70% differential, 40% differential exists because we failed to ask. Right. Chapter 6, in Expect to Win, you don't ask, you don't get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's very true. I think women really must learn to ask. We're always a bit shy about having those conversations about money. Money is important to everyone, so, you know, let's ask. I'm not getting your questions. I don't know if it's because of but the questions are not coming through. I'm sure you have loads of questions. So, and we still have a bit more time before we go to lunch, so I'll just ask a few more. Let's talk a little bit about quotas. Okay. It's kind of controversial. So Norway, for example, has that 40% quota for women on boards. The Economist recently did, thank you, you know, some research, you know, it's been 10 years now. It's sort of mixed results. Some of it has worked quite well. A lot of people, men and women, have issues with quotas. Yeah. They think, you know, women think, I want the right to get there, and men are like, why can't they earn the right? But obviously some other women think, you know, we need to create quotas until it becomes the norm. So what's your take on all of this?
Yeah, I have to tell you that I feel that you cannot manage what you don't measure. And especially in an industry that's driven by numbers, I think we have to have some targets, is the word I like to use, right? So quotas, you know, it's become such a bad word because people like to say, oh, I don't want to force it, I don't want to lower the bar. And when you start using that language, I don't want to lower the bar just in order to get to the numbers, then you instill fear. It's sort of a backhanded way of instilling fear, because one of the things that I've been saying to senior leaders is that, listen, don't talk about lowering the bar, because there's no woman or person of color that would ever want you to lower the bar. Right? Because that cheapens me. Yeah. So let's not talk about that. That's not happening. That's not what anybody wants. But if you use that language or you have that mentality, it will create a perception that there has been exceptions made. And I don't think you have to make any exceptions whatsoever in order to get to the targets that you're looking for. But I do think it's important to have some targets, because if you're not shooting for something, it's easy for that thing to become secondary or tertiary, or not even on the imperative agenda at all to get done. So I think it's a good thing to do in order to get things going until it naturally becomes a part of the culture. And like I said, we're 30 years into this conversation, and I still don't think that any organization is mature enough for it to just happen without that intentionality and accountability that I was talking about.
Okay, very good. You've heard it from Carla. Let's have some targets. Okay, so no quotas, but let's have some targets. We have quite a number of questions from you know, the audience. Someone's asking about work-life balance. Can you comment on work-life balance as a working woman, and maybe talk about in the context of having it all, because you look like someone that actually does have it all.
Yeah, and I actually do feel like I did, and I have to give my mother a lot of credit because she was a career woman, she was a wife, she was a mom, she was very involved in her community, and she had her own extracurricular activities. So I actually grew up with a model that you could have it all. You didn't have to make these compromises. But one thing I also learned is that you have to define what all is for you. And so often women don't think that they're measuring up because they are measuring their life against somebody else's report card.
Yeah.
And the only thing that matters is what works in your household. And so you have to make sure that you've defined that and then live according to that. So if having it all means having a spouse, having kids, having a great career, having an outside life, then you got to figure out what's the formula that works in your household. My husband and I adopted a little girl in 2015. She was 3 weeks and 2 days old. So she is 3 years old now. But we don't do it alone. First of all, we have a real partnership around her. I'm often on the road, so he's primarily the person that's taking her to school every morning, getting her up in the morning. We also have a nanny. We also have a great babysitter. But at the end of the day, you know, we're very involved in her life. But it's figuring out what works in your household. I'll tell you a funny story about not having traditional roles. And again, it's for what's in your household. I had a little girl that I loved to spend time with. She was 7. She came over to the house, and I said, well, we're going to have a great day. We're going to make pizza. We're going to make cookies. We're going to do all this stuff. Yeah. And this was before I had my daughter. And then she said, Miss Carla, I want a tour of your house. So we're going around the house, and I said, oh, Mr. Victor, because my husband's name is Victor, I said, Mr. Victor painted this room. This is my prayer room, and he did this. Oh, Mr. Victor did this over here. Then we went upstairs, and there were some clothes there, and my husband swears he could do laundry better than I do. But, you know, he says, I'll take care of that because you're going to have everything pink because you're going to put the reds in with the whites. You're going to have everything pink. So that's something that he does, and I think he likes to do it because it's good mental whatever. So I said, oh, Mr. Victor didn't fold these clothes, and so let me close this room right there. He just didn't get to these. And then later I said, I'm making this, but Mr. Victor loves to make chili. And she said, wait, Mr. Victor did that other room. Mr. Victor cooks the chili, and Mr. Victor did the laundry. What do you do? And I said, And I was trying to justify what I did in the household to this 7-year-old. But I do contribute. But I mean, at the end of the day, that works for us because he took that over, didn't want me to do that because he said I couldn't. Now, I didn't marry him till I was 38, so clearly I know how to do some laundry. But he swears I didn't know how to do laundry. But again, it's finding what works for you. If it's having your mother and your father involved in your household. I have friends where their mother and father has come in and they're the caretakers because they're two working people. Yeah. But it really is about defining and being honest for that, not letting society or your family or anybody else define what success looks like for you.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. That's very helpful. My own takeaway from that was really one thing. I really want Victor to have a conversation with my husband at the end of this because I think it's very important. There are lots of lessons to be learned here. You know what I'm saying, guys?
And he has a full-time job. He's a college professor. But we have divided the duties in the household differently. Yeah. Right.
It's important. Let's find what works for us. Let's use our partnerships effectively. Someone's asking a question about, when you think about Nigeria and Africa and how patriarchal our society, just traditional structures, and what needs to be done and how you think about how we start to attack those sort of stereotypes and those structures. How do we change that, or how do we disrupt that?
Yeah, and that's it. That's the word. You have to disrupt, and that's why I said don't let your families come in because our families are very important to us. And your mother and your father, they have a voice in your life, and they do until you become an adult. But if you have something that's working with your partner that's different, I think you really do have to try to educate the other generation. And it's not easy. I understand that. And I understand that, traditions are traditions. But I think you got to hold your ground and say, Mom, this is what's working for us. And, Ade, I'm just picking on Ade because I met him partner, or, Banji's a great partner and this is how we do it, right? And say, listen, he's not like Dad. He's thinking about it a little differently. So I think you have to try to educate the generation that's above us and then be a different example for your kids. Because they're going to be living in a different world than your parents' world. And you want them to be able to have a structure that's going to be happy and not feel like they're forced into a definition that doesn't fit that union.
Okay, very good. How much time do we have left? I think we're...
7 seconds.
Oh, really? Okay, I'll ask one more question and then have you wrap up. You talked a lot about finding your voice and not losing it. And I think it's important because women often lose their voice when they get to the table. So what advice would you give a young woman out here who is, struggling to find her voice and learn how to use it properly?
Yes, I love that question. So first of all, again, remember that you have received the opportunity that you have received because you are that good.
Yeah.
So don't question yourself. Don't fall prey to the imposter syndrome. Don't sit there and say, oh, I shouldn't say that because what are they going to think? Yeah. You do not know what anybody else is thinking unless you are clairvoyant. So don't create that in your own mind. Get out there. And the more you put forth your ideas, the more you will want to put forth your ideas.
Yeah.
And the more you put your ideas in that marketplace, i.e. where you're working, the more the organization will want to hear you.
Yeah.
And it's going to take some trial and error before you realize when the right place is to come into the conversation, who you should follow, and you should figure out who's in the room, who's going to be a friend, who's going to be a foe. Who already really likes me, who's not yet on my success team. And maybe you want to be strategic about when you pipe in. So George is really great. He's very inclusive. I'm going to make sure I attach my comment to George.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to wait, and when Marcia says something, I'm going to actually agree with her. But you have to get in there and say something. Don't do what I did in the early days, and you would sit there with a great comment, and you say, oh, but that kind of sounds like what Peter said. Oh, that kind of sounds like what Paul said. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm not going to say anything. So before you know it, you went meeting after meeting. I went meeting after meeting after meeting, not saying anything because I'm thinking that's not additive. That's not really different. That's not really smart. Yeah. Or that is really additive, but he's not going to like it if I say that, so I'm not going to say that. Yeah. And then what really pushed me was another senior woman said to somebody else said, boy, that Carla Harris is really sharp. And she said, really? She never says anything. I don't know if she's smart or she's stupid. And I said, me? Quiet? But then I realized I had swallowed my voice. I had swallowed my voice. I'd let the organization, make me question all these different things about myself, so I wasn't saying anything. So then I had to jump into the game. I had to make myself say things so that I could get in the habit. And once the organization is used to hearing your voice, then you can use silence as power. Then they'll say, oh, Faye, you didn't say anything about that. What are you thinking? Right? But they have to hear you first. So practice. And if you've gone 3 times in a meeting and you haven't said anything, then that 4th time, you better say something. And excuse me here, gentlemen. Let me speak to the ladies for a second. If you are at a loss for what to say, just do like the boys do. Say something somebody else said, but just move the preposition and move the period. It works every time.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Ladies
you,
and
Faye.
gentlemen,
Thank you.
Carla Harris, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.